Thank you. I was saying as I'm coming up with this introduction, how do I not disappoint? It's going to be a complicated. I think 15 minutes is what I have, but maybe I can go a little longer, right? I think so. I will eat into your lunch just a little bit. I get 25 minutes. Okay, so I start again. You've been promised fireworks, I guess. You know, I'm not going to give you fireworks. Michael is taking a seat on the sofa, I think. And I shall not, as Michael sometimes suggests, dictate to any country what they wish to do, OECD or otherwise. And I think we've long gone past this, even if some remind us of this. And part of the introduction, Mukesh, I think you've already taken the words out of my mouth. It is a personal journey that also brings me back here, which is why I'm very happy to be here today. And I think it's a bit of personal journey that I want to share also because it remembers and sort of brings back also what we did yesterday with Roy and your personal experience with Roy. And I think I had a very similar personal experience as a young man 25 years ago when I was here in New Delhi. And I think that's my affiliation, I guess, is as old as the first Congress here that you held. And I find that all quite interesting how it comes together. If we think about where we are on Pillar 1, I was saying yesterday over dinner, it's almost ironic that we still have the Mitchell B. Carroll Prize if you dig a little into what Mitchell B. Carroll actually did and what that means for arm's length in the market. So it's somewhat ironic even for IFA to reflect the person and the achievement of the person in whose name the prize is given, and I find that. One thing on a personal level that I think I also wanted to share is that when Professor Fogel was trying to persuade me that I should seek my career in international taxation and eventually become a professor, and I failed him on this, and he's still disappointed with me somewhere up there that I didn't do this. He said, look, Achim, the reason you want to do international taxation, it is like playing three-dimensional chess. It's fascinating, and it's the only academic discipline that does this, and while you play three-dimensional chess, people actually pay you for this. It's a fascinating thing. And then he said a second thing, which brings me back to India. He said, and you know what? Some of the best international chess players, you know where they are? They are in India. And sort of it also reminded me of my last 6 years with Rashmi, who sits there. We've been playing three-dimensional chess for the last 6 years, and we have been paid for this. Maybe not enough as we should. Perhaps we should get more than 25%, you know, and some of it should come to us. And maybe not just with a 10% margin, but that's a separate question. So I was reflecting on this a little bit as, you know, I was thinking about what am I going to tell you about the future of global tax policy making. And my crystal ball is probably as good as your crystal ball. It's a perpetually evolving world, but it's a very fascinating world where we have many tendencies, and I will focus on, I think, the Indian G20 theme of one world. I will focus on one big tent. I think we're focusing far too much on some of the divisions, and when we do this, we forget what actually brings us together. And it's what one of the co-chairs of the inclusive framework, Marlene, tells me. Look, when you are a doctor, you think that every person is sick because you don't see the healthy. And when we sometimes talk about the divisions that we have, we forget to realize how much commonalities we do have in this wider world. When we focus on the OECD country, not OECD country, the inclusive framework countries, we sometimes fall into the trap that is a trap by our friends from media to make a good story. But that good story is actually not reality. And that's what I'm trying to tell you in my remaining 20 minutes. And I start with my first slide without having a clicker, but I guess we can go to the next slide. I don't know if somebody can click because I brought you a picture. There is the clicker, and there is the picture. And I'm bringing you pictures, right? I don't bring you a lot of text. And my first message here that I want to bring to you, this whole OECD-UN debate is not a cricket match. Now, I must admit that when I gave a similar observation in Porus's panel, who might be watching here today, and that was in Mexico, I referred not to cricket, admittedly, but to football. And I thought, I need to adapt it in this world, right? And what am I trying to say here? There's a story out here that makes for very good billings, that says, you know, Mr. Leonard here in the blue trousers and Mr. Pross in the red trousers, let's watch them, right? It's a Hollywood movie. There's a showdown, there's a vote, there's a win, there's this, there's that. It does make for a great story. But it is not necessarily helpful because it's not necessarily accurate. It creates division where we need to come together. And this is also, if you read an article that one of the former chairs of the inclusive framework were the theme that he's using. Because we actually work together. We have dinners together. Sometimes we have coffees together. You know, Mr. Leonard comes to the tax certainty day. We come to the UN Tax Committee meetings. The United Nations Secretariat comments on the drafting of the MLC, and sometimes they're not quite happy because they make good comments, and sometimes the Secretariat doesn't take them. That happens to all of us, also happens to me. So if this was a cricket match, you typically wouldn't have the staff of one team trying to help the other team, and we're doing the same. We actually go to UN Tax Committee, we make observations, we sit there, we've been sitting there. I went there to Geneva 100 years ago, one of my first assignments as an intern at the OECD. The second, I think, is also sometimes the public discourse airbrushes the existence of the UN Tax Committee out of existence. It's a suggestion that all the tax work in the world is done by Dr. Pross. Now, as much as I would love this, sadly, that's not true. And I guess it's also an insult a little bit to Lieselot, and I was on the panel with Porus again at IFA, and there was me sitting there, and next to me was Armando, the former chair of the UN Tax Committee, who also happens to be the chair of Working Party 10 and was a fantastic chair at both committees, and without him, we wouldn't have the CRS. So did he maybe do it also in his capacity as the UN committee chair, and so the CRS is a common good, and can we think of it like this? Or do we need to see, oh, this one day he was an OECD person, we like him, the other day he was a UN person, we don't like him, or the other way around? And so the world is just more complicated than this narrative that's being suggested to us, and when we understand and accept that that's what it is, I think we're moving on to a better constructive discussion in how this moves forward. And the same is true also for all of you. There is just many, many countries that play staying with cricket in all of those teams. India co-chairs our work on exchange of information. Rashmi's voice in the steering group, believe me, and I guess as we were saying yesterday, you probably wouldn't have the design of Pillar 1 if people like Rashmi were not inside the design of this pillar. And so there is now more than 140 countries in the inclusive framework. There's about 170 countries in the Global Forum. And they like to stick with the cricket in both teams, apparently. And so the analogy, I think we need to think about it differently and stop thinking in those pictures, because, coming back to my one world big tent, there's a lot less division than the media suggests. Go back to automatic exchange of information. I think there's a UN resolution that endorses the standard. It's endorsed by 170 countries now in the Global Forum. There is not much division, if we think about it. And I don't think on the transparency agenda, I guess as was mentioned, we did a report on behalf of the Indian presidency, and we hope to continue that work with the Brazilian presidency because we think we need to move further on tax transparency. There's questions of wider use, there's questions of real estate, there's other things that we need to do. We're not done on beneficial ownership. And when I speak we, I don't speak for me as a German, Rashmi as an Indian, or Michael Leonard an Australian. I think we speak for we as the group of the tax fraternity to improve the lives of people. And I think that's also true when you look at other areas. Much of BEPS 1, sometimes also misunderstood by the IBFD, is actually a toolkit. That's what we did. So if you have this problem, you can use those tools. So for instance, interest limitation is something where we find, and it's a tool that many countries haven't used maybe to the extent that they should. And so of the 90 countries that now have adopted interest limitations, 45 of them are developing countries, if you think that is a meaningful dimension. Some other measures has not been adopted, but that is not a sign of failure of BEPS or not BEPS. It's just a question, here is a tool, if you have that problem, here is a solution. And I think we need more tools and templates for countries to use that. And I think, even if you now go into the pillars, what's the division on pillars? We have discussion about the complexity around pillar 2, but let's face it, a global minimum tax is never going to be easy. And also coming back to Chetan's presentation of yesterday, there's a lot of coming together in a BIP 10 sort of way of providing the assistance and the capacity by not just, again, and this is important, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, ATAF, many people around the world see it to help people implement it if they so choose. And even on Pillar 1, staying with the theme of, what brings us together, if you think about the direction of travel, I think, is one direction, right? You may be arguing about, the amounts, and you may be arguing about particular features. But as a community, I think we have made tremendous progress in the design and in the reflection, because this is a thought process where we need to be honest and come together and think about building a house. And then I think, there's also some other reflections, which is why this is not a cricket match. In fact, there will be different templates for different situations. And this is the current architecture, right? So we have a UN model, and that UN model has particular features, I guess, as Michael will tell us and everybody knows, that are destined in particular for particular interests of low-income countries, right? And more source taxation and withholding taxes and others. And there's a template also for other countries. I don't think we will ever be in a world where the world will have one model. I think it's good to provide different templates for different countries to choose from when they deal bilaterally. Similarly, on transfer pricing, there may be some differences. Let's talk about those differences. And if you think about the pillars, there is an amount B, and maybe the amount B is a part of the answer, because many of the differences and the difficulties in transfer pricing are related to simplification and the ability to use the standards. Some of those standards are too complicated. They're not necessarily intellectually wrong, you would say, but they're too complicated. So how can you reduce the complexity of some of those, but keep the principles together? And there's a real conversation, and that's also why there's a UN transfer pricing manual. Much of it is a simpler an application rather than a fundamental disagreement with the principles. And so there is this conversation. So let's have this conversation and think about it, but also let's not sort of suppose that we needed to live in a world where there is one template because every country is the same country and has the same interests. And this is even more interesting. You have some hybrid, so to speak, developing countries that with one particular country or set of countries actually have the OECD model, and with another set, they take the UN provision. So even countries themselves are sometimes split. So this simplistic box drawing, I think, is not a correct reflection of the world that we are. And when we realize, and the more we realize this, I think the easier it is to project out into the future. And then maybe just two final points on my first slide, and the others are going to be faster. There are many more players in this. This is also why it's not a cricket match between two teams here, right? There is the IMF that's tremendously important for many African countries, in particular in the area of VAT. There's ATAF that has a very important voice in discussion. There's PCLAC in Latin America now. There's CIAT. There's many regional players and others, and I'm doing the list. And if you're in Europe, of course, there's the EU with all its own challenges and dimensions. And so I think the big plea here as we think about this, that we think about this ourselves as sort of one community and not having this sort of simplistic idea that there somehow could be this one big battle, because we will be disappointed. We have a debt crisis. We have an energy crisis. We have a leftover COVID crisis. We have real issues. And we need to now come together. We even need to come together and think about, even if in this room it's our favorite pastime to spend a lot of time on CIT, right? Like when you read the studies of the IMF and others, they tell us, well, if you want to be serious about domestic resource mobilization, CIT is a contribution, but when you look at the numbers, that contribution, no matter how we design Pillar 1, will be limited. There is a lot more money in, PIT, in VAT. If you look at some of the low-income countries and their tax to GDP, and in order to get it up, there is no design of Pillar 1 that will fill that gap. We cannot promise this to the world, whoever it is, because we will not be able to deliver that. So we also need to realistic and understand what it is and how it needs to come together. And if we do it like that, rather than like on that picture, I am continuously optimistic that we can get there. Now, that was a very long first slide. I promised Mukesh on the others I will be quicker. Now, let me see whether I can get to my second slide. The second slide, I think, this is actually the third one. Hold on. Apparently, it's the second one. The second one not to do, just to give you an image, I guess, is there is now a public discourse that sometimes is slightly unbecoming, I think, to our international tax fraternity that I feel quite attached as a disciple of Professor Vogel and others. And what I mean by this, we all understand that we need a narrative for our political masters, right? We need to have a soundbite. But there's a soundbite and there's a soundbite, right? We should be having tax talks. And I'm not talking to anybody in this room here, right? But take an example, my two favorite examples, and there's many others, where now tax is being the profession of everybody, and that's a fair conversation because we need to have civil society, we need to have all actors in this conversation. But I think we also need to sort of think about what it is and how far we go. So, for instance, my friend Mr. Gabriel Zuckman keeps telling the substance-based carve-out that we discussed yesterday a loophole. It isn't a loophole, but newspapers copy this and say there's a lot of loopholes because it's in a study. But it isn't a loophole. It doesn't meet, and I would conclude with the previous speaker, whether it's in the OECD or coming out, but no dictionary definition would allow you to say that the substance carve-out is a loophole. You might disagree with the policy and you can say that. You think the substance carve-out is wrong. But it is not a loophole. It was a deliberate policy decision by over 100 countries that was the design that they preferred in order to come to a compromise. And I think we need to be careful. There's always a suggestion that we also hear sometimes, and this is a bit of a personal observation if you allow, that the OECD Secretariat is in the pocket of big business and rich people, and we have a rich man's agenda. I have yet to find, please find him, a rich person that thinks ending bank secrecy and introducing a global minimum tax is a rich man's agenda. So I think we just need to sort of, as we move to a constructive discussion, also in the public space, have some of this in mind. And there's many more examples, but I wanted to note twice. The other one I think I wanted to say, and I think there, like with many things, Michael and myself would probably agree, that actually consensus has its merits as a principle. Sometimes we've been criticized that we have a consensus principle. But the principle of consensus, I think, makes a lot of sense. And I think we should cherish it also. It means that every voice needs to be heard. It also means that our solutions are more complicated, right? And India, as the largest democracy on the planet, probably knows that if you want to have all those voices in a democracy, your solutions are sometimes a bit more complicated as compared to a situation where one person decides, right? It's a lot cleaner, but you need to find yourself in the outcome, right? And so if you just, and this maybe also explains the complexity. Simple example, you have 100 countries in Pillar 1 or any other project, and all of those 100 countries, and take India because we're here, and let's say India has 5 particular issues. We still have a footnote, so we'll get there. But say there's 5 particular issues, or 10, and then you just do math, and you multiply it. Now you can just say, well, I'm gonna ignore you, so I'm not gonna do anything about you. That's easy, my solution is simpler, right? But if I actually want to address the key red lines of these countries, I need to think about a solution for this. So 100 times 5 times 6, you have 600 solutions that you need to solve. And so you will have more complicated. And I mean, another question perhaps on the complexity that this brings. So yes, the solutions that you sometimes bring are complicated. But sometimes I say, and this is my salesman job, of course, you also find that driving a car is relatively easy, but engineering a car is actually quite complicated. It's true, Pillar 1 gives you a lot of pages, but that is also what people ask us to do. They wanted to have the clarity and the certainty of what the solution actually does, because they might actually sign up to this solution and make it the law. And I think when you have consensus, it also provides a particular dynamic. It also gives confidence to countries that I can join in this process because I know that my voice will be there and so I will be heard. Otherwise, it would be easy. We could just, as much as I would love it, we could just outvote the US, right? It'd be done. We could also outvote Brazil, Colombia, and India, but none of this really makes sense. So I think, wholly apart from the fact when you think of EU and other situations, I think consensus, we need to really think about it and be cautious before we wanted to dismiss the consensus principle. And I think the real issue here isn't so much perhaps the consensus, but consensus is an opportunity that you need to have the capacity to use. And I think that's where the conversation is. How do you have the capability to make use of that voice that you have? How can we help countries in these complicated discussions to have that voice? And I can see that, having done the inclusive framework for 10 years, 15 years, it's been a journey. I think India has clearly found its voice. I'm not worried. Others have come more recently in this process, and you can see it in the outcomes, but it is a journey. I think TikTok I can skip because I think I've done this. My next principle of the principles of Professor Vogel's principles of global tax policy making is intellectual honesty. And again, not in this room, but in the public discourse. You can say, I don't like Pillar 1, and it is perfectly legitimate, right? But I'm struggling, for instance, with the notion that we sometimes hear, Pillar 1 is too complicated, we should do formula apportionment. Formula apportionment isn't simple, we need to be honest, right? We need a common tax base, we need revenue sourcing rules, we need to figure out the exclusions, extractives in, extractives out. What do we do? Do we allocate it to the market? What do we do with the weird outcomes, as Mr. Spencer, our common friends, tells us that all of a sudden you may have a very profitable activity in India because we're here, right? But tomorrow you might not be able to tax it because there's some losses somewhere else. And if it's all one pie, maybe overall the company doesn't actually make any money. So today you can tax it, tomorrow you can't. You need to accept that too, right? That's a consequence of formula apportionment. You need to think about the allocation factor, and then you need to think about whether a country would actually benefit, because it also depends on whether you have a market. Small developing country, small market, small allocation on the destination, and employment, certainly for the most profitable, might not be there. There's also people that tell us that under the headline of intellectual honesty, you should do a Pillar 2 with a 20% rate, no substance carve out, and you should not interfere with the sovereign rights of developing countries to have tax incentives. That doesn't come together. And then my last point, and then I think I am accelerating, I think we need to be cautious with label. And this comes back to my first point a bit. I think it's clearly the case, as many studies show, that there's distinct features that bring together lower capacity jurisdiction. But sometimes defining the whole world as something, there's a developing country and a non-developing country, also misses the point. There's a developing country that's the second largest economy in the world. There's a developing country that has a space program. There's a developing country that has a very large market. There's a developing country that has a very large market and no extractive sector. And the list goes on. And so I think the important part here also is, I think, and we can see this in the amount B conversation. We can see this in the extractives conversation. We can see this in many areas that we need to understand ourselves. We're all unique in this room. We're not just male or German or Indian or female. We have many attributes by which we define ourselves, which we need to understand. And I was at a panel in Mexico, and the question was, who's winning the race? Again, in BEPS. But the real question is also, which one is your race before you're trying winning it? Because you're not going to win all of them. So is it actually CIT? Is BEPS your issue? And clearly, when we discuss it, BEPS is an issue because corporate income tax is, relatively speaking, a bigger contributor to government revenues in developing countries overall than it is in others. But you can also say, well, maybe then there is more potential in the other taxes because there you're really lagging. And so it's also understanding the country itself and its capacity and its priorities. Right? What's the point of flying people to one place as opposed to another place if actually your issue is another issue? So giving countries the capacity to also understand their own priorities in the wider tax space. And not because that's what we do, we assume corporate income tax is everything, which of course I love because I know more about corporate income tax than we. These are some general reflections, and the last one is time, and I guess I won't talk about time because otherwise I'm out of time. But one of the most important things, and I guess Michael, you can probably echo this, that we hear from low capacity jurisdictions, and I'm certainly not counting India as one of those, is that they actually need more time. Time to think about, coordinate the position, think about even what is their profile in tax and how can they develop tax to GDP and other things. Time is very precious, and especially also when you make substantial changes to the international taxation framework. We've used 4 years so far. There is a consultation, at least in one country. In some sense, you can say that's good or bad, but I think these things take time. These things need to be thought through. Because when they don't come every other day. And this is not just a political question, it's also a technical question. So solution actually works for businesses that need to apply them, that create stability and sustainability. Let me then move on to the second part in my and this is not my overall reflections that you hopefully find helpful, at least how I conceive of the discussion moving forward without having any particular crystal ball anymore. This is the second part about where are we in the inclusive framework. And yes, the inclusive framework can certainly, and that's not to say, and there's many things that I've heard that certainly speaking, I guess I should have said this like Chetan in the beginning, everything I say does not necessarily reflect of the inclusive framework, the global forum, the OECD, and then there comes a long list. So it's just, it does work with consensus, and you have heard me say that I think consensus has its merits. And it is more than 140 countries, and the Philippines have just joined. And so coming back, I guess there is an interest in being in different teams and understanding that you're more than one and you have more than one dimension. Where are we? Well, one, I don't need to talk you through the global minimum tax. We did that yesterday, so you hear where we are. I also don't need to talk about the pilot programs and all the work because Chetan did that yesterday in terms of providing assistance, not just us, but also others. The subject to tax rule where we are, and on Pillar 1. You know that we're nearing completion. Now, some people would be saying we've always been nearing completion. We keep nearing completion. We hope to have Amount B in the transfer pricing guidelines in January, and that is the plan. That's on its way. A very significant simplification of transfer pricing, in particular for jurisdictions that actually don't have comparables. I think that's a very important piece, and coming back where I see linkages also with the OECD standards as a conceptual matter, and some of the simplification needs that low-income countries have. But interestingly also that business is advocating, and there's some very interesting cross-sections that you have a very strong support from the business community that wants simplification and certainty, as well as low-income jurisdictions that don't have the capacity because they don't have access to fancy databases and other things, and they may not have local comps. And so that is what we're hoping to do. As you have heard, I think from people more important than me, including the Secretary of the Treasury, we will not have a signing ceremony before the end of the year, but that's not the end of the story. On Pillar 1. And I'm happy to talk more about Pillar 1, but I'm not going to do it now. And perhaps I can do this over lunch if people have questions where we are specifically one, because I see this as a wider presentation reflecting on global tax policy making. This just gives you numbers, and I can go quick, we can make these slides available, but it just shows you that there is a journey for broader and more inclusive discussion around a range of, that sometimes don't make the headline, right? We never talk about VAT, despite the fact that in many countries that's what the money is, but you know, there's a lot to be done. In VAT, there's a lot of toolkits, there's a lot of possibilities, including in the digital space, to first of all collect the VAT, and some countries don't even do this. And that's very uncontroversial. And so that's a very important dimension. The Global Forum on Tax Transparency, I'm not going to take you through all those numbers, but it does show you that the international tax community has been broadening out, and that is the direction of travel. And you see this, we even had to update this yesterday because the crypto asset reporting is now at 54 and it was at 48. And the Global Forum was at 168, now it's 170. So we have almost sort of daily updates. And I think that's a success story for the international community. It's not a platform here, platform there. It's that we as countries, it's always the countries, and the rest is just the platform where they come together to advance a common agenda. Now this is, and I don't have time for this, but just to also remind you that while we talk about the pillars, there's a lot of other work in the tax world that's tremendously important, whether that's on capacity building, whether the work on tax certainty, that also came under the Chinese G20 presidency when you think about the influences and where they come from. The work on tax crime, where we now have a pilot program also under the Indian presidency here, very important to the reality of fighting illicit financial flows. Not just the legal tax, but like making it real, because you need people, investigations to actually then do the work. The work on tax transparency, consumption taxes, tax policy analysis, saving the planet, tax and the environment, where importantly also I think the OECD is doing a technical piece of allowing different countries to convert their different measures into a common unit to see how we're all moving forward, but without dictating what the particular measure should be. And then the next slide I brought, and it's almost my second to last, is just to give you also an example where we should be reminded that ministers always ask for the next global tax policy initiative, but in the reality, very often it's the implementation of the existing initiatives of the things, that's what we've done. And there is a project that we are doing together with UNDP on Tax Inspectorate Without Borders and what this is generating. And if you look at the small print, this also includes the World Bank, this includes ATAF and others. There is a lot of money in applying correctly with the capacity that you need the existing standards. We're always tempted to add the new standard, right? But this is just applying the rules as we have them, enabling countries to benefit from them in the way that they should with the capacity that they. And so we always need to bring in the tax administration in the policy. But then to finish on the policy space, we think about, you know, the principles in some sense. Also to give you some sense, when we did a stakeholder meeting in July of the inclusive framework, those 140 countries that came together, we had breakout sessions and we said, like, what do you see on the agenda? This may not be representative of the whole world, it's 140 countries. What were some of their ideas, what were coming out? The clear one, and again, Michael, we will be saying the same thing, and in some sense you can see this on top almost as a chapeau, supporting domestic resource mobilization. And again, there's CIT, but there's PIT, there's health taxes, there's property tax. I was once, because I happen to speak French, in a meeting of the French African finance ministers. And I spoke to one, and I don't give the name, African finance minister, French speaking. And he said, this is all interesting what you do, but there's two things if you could give me, I would be really interested. I said, what are these two? And I will tell you what you told me in French. No, I'm not, I'm telling you in English. He said, look, one is a property tax system, because I don't even know who owns the property in my country, and VAT on informal traders. And so there's also some of those realities that need to be brought into the conversation that sometimes we tend to forget. And so this is an extremely wide topic where, coming together with my big tent, this is probably the time where, whether it's the UN, the OECD, the IMF, and others should come together and pool the tools and the resources they have to enhance the effectiveness through the platform of collaboration and tax and other platforms, that we come together and maximize the impact we can have for all of them, whatever then I think the particular policy needs are. Global mobility, and I think I don't need to talk much about this, a big topic that we all see with very different features in different countries, whether that's brain drain in some of the developing world, whether that's the taxation of high net worth individuals, whether that's the concern about the home office PC, the standardization, whether that's the taxation of cross-border employment income and what that funds, whether that's social security, pensions, etc. Sort of there's a lot in it. Tax transparency, I think I've mentioned, the journey isn't complete. More work on beneficial ownership, more work on real estate. Interconnected registers is something that we explored in the response also to the Indian G20 presidency. There's a question, and this will resonate with Professor Singh, and I keep this to the end here because I'm looking straight at you, that is there always ever going to be some simplification in all of this, or will you guys, whoever you are, UN, OECD, IMF, just ever add complexity? There is a discussion that is also taking place whether there is an opportunity with the introduction of Pillar 2, both on the substantive side, to maybe then remove certain other measures that are targeted at the same risks, to simplify CIT, and also to think about new dimensions of compliance that could perhaps be more system, which also connects to, I think, the panel we have in the afternoon. And then tax and inequality, I think, again, there's some crossover with global mobility, but there's an overall sense that the tax system needs to contribute more to reduce inequality domestically, perhaps globally. What is that? Thoughts about capital income taxation, effective rates. We've done a lot of analytical work that indicates that some of those tax disparities may not be justifiable, especially in an environment, and this is probably the concluding comment, especially in an environment where many of us, wherever we sit and however we describe ourselves, are facing a severe shortage of funds to change, to pay for the climate transition, for debt, for COVID, for many other things where we know that we the sources of revenue. And I think that, to me, I guess it's the time, it's more a big tent than a cricket match, and then we got a better chance.